This Shabbat is our annual Saxe Scholar in Residence program established by George and Dorothy Saxe. And I did not have the pleasure of knowing George, but I have learned from Dorothy and from Rabbi Martyr a little bit about George, who, as many of you know, was a founding member and past president of our congregation, a veteran of World War II, a beloved husband, father, and grandfather, a successful businessman, and a passionate philanthropist who was a leader in both the Jewish and arts communities. We remember George on this Shabbat, and we also honor Dorothy and the generations of their family. And Dorothy, I want to thank you for the warmth and humor with which you have welcomed me into the Beth Am community. Our periodic conversations have been a balm during this complicated year. So please include me in an ever-growing group of your, for lack of a better term, fans. As I have learned, and as you must know, you have quite a devoted fan base, and we are all inspired by your dedication to learning, your stalwart leadership, and by your humility. In these weeks between Pesach and Shavuot, it is our custom to read from the tractate of the Mishnah, known as Pirkei Avot. In the fourth chapter of this collection of rabbinic teachings, we read, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Shlosha chetarim hem, keter Torah, v'cheter kehuna, v'cheter malchut, v'cheter shem tov, ole al gabehen. Rabbi Shimon said, there are three crowns, the crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of royalty. But the crown of a good name excels them all. Commentators note that this is a lesson on the excellence of personal character as compared with acquired status. Priesthood and kingship are conferred upon individuals without any necessary reference to personal character. Even the crown of Torah, the fame of a great teacher, can be acquired by one who lacks integrity. But the crown of a good name, a good reputation, is the tribute paid to upright character, and it is better than all the others because it alone is indispensable. Dorothy, I know that you are likely repelled by the notion of wearing a crown, but the root of the word in Hebrew for crown, keter, is also the root of the word mukhtar, meaning to be distinguished. And the Saxe family name is distinguished by its reputation for good deeds and its commitment to Jewish leadership. Thank you for all that you've done for Congregation Beth Am, including the establishment of this annual Scholar in Residence program, so that we might all have the opportunity to learn from outstanding Jewish teachers. And on this Shabbat, our teacher is Dr. Lila Corwin Berman. Lila is professor of history at Temple University, where she holds the Friedman Chair of American Jewish History and directs the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History. She received her BA from Amherst College and her Ph.D. from Yale. Professor Berman is author of the American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, the history of a multi-billion-dollar institution, as well as Metropolitan Jews, politics, race, and religion in post-war Detroit. And she also wrote Speaking of Jews, Rabbis, Intellectuals, and the Creation of an American Public Identity. Her articles have appeared in several scholarly journals, and she has also written guest columns for the Washington Post, the Forward, and the Jewish Week. She serves as the chair of the Academic Council of the American Jewish Historical Society, and this year is a fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. Professor Berman lives in Philadelphia with her husband, who is a professor of classics, and their two children. The title of Professor Berman's talk this evening is, You Shall Not Copy the Practices of the Land, American Jews and the Practices of American Racism. Professor Berman will also join us at the foyer immediately following this service for a Q&A session. And then tomorrow afternoon at 4, we'll have another opportunity from our scholar in virtual residence. The title and subject of our program tomorrow is American Jews and White Supremacy, the Dilemmas of History, Power, and Politics. We will conclude tomorrow's program with Havdalah, and I hope to see you there. And now, Professor Berman, I am thrilled to welcome you to our virtual Bima.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to be part of your community this weekend. Thank you, Rabbi Morrison and the Saxe family. And of course, I'm really kind of disappointed to be addressing you from my home in Philadelphia, where it's dark, and not yours in California, where I assume the sun is shining, as it always is in California, despite the television show that it's always sunny in Philadelphia. So I prepared these remarks before the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial was announced. But as I talk to you tonight and tomorrow, that verdict is really very much on my mind. I am looking toward the future, wondering how we turn this small piece of accountability into a true movement for justice. But since I'm a historian, I'm also looking to the past, and I'm wondering about the full extent of practices, policies, and structures upon which our discriminatory and violent policing system has been built and through which it has been validated. My intention for this weekend is to use the tools of history and historical thinking to suggest ways that we might keep our eyes on the largest dimensions of American racism, while also training ourselves to see the small and quotidian dimensions that persistently sanction it. So from my preliminary conversations with Rabbi Morrison, I know your community has been studying racism and reckoning with your own positions within its sweep. Especially the latter piece is best done in relationship. Often we academics imagine our practice requires detachment, and sometimes we use that detachment to claim authority and perhaps to shelter ourselves from the implications of our own critiques. But as you will see, I will not try to pull any punches about the fact that all of this is personal for me. And I hope that in doing so, we can, even if just virtually, build a relationship. This week's Parsha, double Parsha, is full of anxiety about holiness, but also a more generalized anxiety about how to live in a world we cannot control. As the Israelites wander in that liminal space between chaos and cosmos, disorder and order, the text tells us that they were provided with rules to draw lines between holy and not holy, between us and them. The text explains, "You shall not copy the practices of the land of Egypt where you dwelt, or the land of Canaan to which I'm taking you, nor shall you follow their customs. My norms alone shall you observe and faithfully follow my laws." The Israelites are instructed to imagine themselves as a people apart, unsullied by the messiness of the broader world. Hardly a more controlling vision was there, and perhaps never a more impossible one. Can we live with others and not engage in a process of mimesis, of modeling and copying and exchanging? The very rules in the Torah and elaborated over the centuries by rabbinic commentators may serve as proof that the answer is in fact no. And this is evidenced by obsessive attention to rules and rituals intended to stanch the inevitable flows among peoples and their practices. Like some of you, I think, last summer I read Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy. In a small reading group of friends, I completed the cycle of prompts. With Saad's definition in mind, white supremacy, she writes, is a racist ideology that is based upon the belief that white people are superior in many ways to people of other races, and that therefore white people should be dominant over other races. With that definition in mind, I excavated my past. Small snippets, things I'd not thought about in years, wove together into disturbing patterns. I thought about Agatha, the only Black child in my elementary school class, who my friends and I teased, and whose birthday party my mother made me attend, to my great shame, because no one else I knew was going. And I thought about the solitary Black family on my block, whose daughter came over in the mornings so her mom could leave for work before the bus came, and who indulged my questions about her hair as I ate my cereal, and so on and so forth. Dutifully, painfully, I wrote about these experiences and others, scripting my life into a story I had never recognized or told. Here's what I realized. While I have spent much of my career studying the large structures that have perpetuated racism and white supremacy in the United States, I have avoided thinking about racism and white supremacy as features of my own life, my own behavior and practices. Even now, note the examples I shared came from my childhood, not my present. Of course, this was Saad's point, and I am little else if not a good student. Along the way, however, I also realized that the same disjuncture between my thinking about structures and my thinking about myself was recognizable to me from my historical subjects, who like me, who like the community imagined by the Parsha, maybe who like you, often believed we could separate ourselves from the structures of the world around us, structures, after all, that we had not made. Let me offer an example. For a book I wrote about Jewish urban politics a few years ago, I researched American Jews' movement out of cities and into suburbs after World War II, and I focused in particular on Detroit. Study after study showed that American Jews left cities with more alacrity than other similarly situated urban dwellers, for example, Italian Catholics or Greek Orthodox. Historians explain that so-called white flight precipitated the rise of conservative politics, fueled by an investment in private property protections and enabled by housing and financial policy inscribed with racist logics. But what struck me as I dug into the archives was that even as the American Jews I was studying operated within this exact system, they nonetheless continued to subscribe to a worldview steeped in civil rights and anti-discrimination efforts. That is, they lived within the structure, but conceived of their politics as somehow resisting its logic. Does this sound familiar? To be sure, some of my historical subjects noted a kind of cognitive dissonance between their actions, generally leaving neighborhoods that were becoming home to more Black families, and their beliefs about civil rights. But most of us don't live well with cognitive dissonance, so the more common response I found was a change in how these Jews talked about their political lives, shifting from a language of personal obligation to one of a more removed sense of political responsibility. The historical contours of this transformation followed the spatial and chronological changes in Jewish neighborhood life in Detroit. In the 20s, 30s, and 40s, Jews tended to respond to the influx of Black families into their residential spaces with grassroots organizing to prevent what they called neighborhood change. They formed associations and took actions to stop Jewish families from leaving, with door-to-door campaigns to convince Jewish families not to sell their homes, or cleanup drives to spruce up the neighborhood and prove it remained a good place to live, or education campaigns to help Jews learn how to be good neighbors to non-whites. These efforts all hinged on individual action, asking people to make commitments to staying put and investing in the neighborhood, whether this meant learning how to live with a more diverse set of neighbors and trying to convince Jews not to sell to Black families. By the 1950s and 60s, however, the strategies shifted away from the grassroots and personalized and toward a more remote form of politics focused on structures more than individuals. Leaders of the local Jewish Community Council noted that instead of focusing on the action of individual Jews, they would broaden their horizons to legislation and policy reform. One of the leaders explained, "It has now been universally recognized that work in neighborhoods, in blocks, even in areas of the city, will not alone be effective in normalizing housing patterns and stabilizing neighborhoods on an integrated basis. Now the main emphasis," he wrote, "has to be placed on achieving an open housing market all over the city. Times have changed." What can we learn from thinking about this transformation from the personalized to the structural, a transformation that happened just as Detroit Jews were leaving urban neighborhoods in greater numbers than ever, and just as the population of Black families in those numbers was increasing? The Jewish residents who worked to stop their neighborhoods from changing, itself a fraught term, used the language of individual transformation, education, and activism. They confronted local shopkeepers who price gouged their Black customers, and they pressured landlords or real estate agents in their communities who sought to turn a quick profit on predatory schemes to rent or sell to Black families. Many of the foot soldiers in these movements, notably, were women who reported things they saw and worked with Black mothers to clean up playgrounds or to pressure the city to put in new sidewalks. But this local and individualized activism ran headlong into its contradictions. Efforts to keep neighborhoods Jewish in Detroit, similar to efforts to keep neighborhoods white in Detroit, were simply inseparable from tactics to stop Black families from entering. A columnist for the Jewish Daily Forward, praising the efforts in Detroit, flailed in his effort to wiggle around the problem. He wrote, "Naturally, we do not say that no one should sell his home to Negroes. This would be discrimination. A normal exchange of homes should take place, and no discrimination of any kind should be practiced. We only wish to caution and warn against panic." If the grassroots and individualized form of activism were plagued by racist logics of boundary maintenance, the larger structural efforts to advocate for citywide fair housing policies or reform the real estate industry seemingly attacked those racist logics, but they also gave individuals a pass when it came to scrutinizing their own practices. For example, in the early 60s, two different housing ordinances appeared before Detroit voters, one that advocated anti-discrimination measures in home sales, and a second that sought to protect the so-called private property rights of white homeowners who wished to refuse to sell to Black families. Jewish groups funded a massive campaign against the second measure, arguing that it was a product of white reactionary racism. Nonetheless, that was the ordinance that passed. And while Jewish groups consoled themselves that the Jewish areas of the city had voted against it, the truth of the matter was that there were very few Jewish precincts left in the city, since so many Jews, no matter their commitment to anti-discrimination in the city, had left it. They were fighting the fight from the green pastures of the suburbs, sending their children to all-white schools and draining the city's tax base. As I worked my way through Saad's book last summer, I kept on thinking about these mid-century Detroit Jews. How like them had I too embraced ideas of big structural change while fleeing the kind of personal responsibility that Saad was demanding? For certain, it made me feel uncomfortable to rehearse the times in my life when I used my privilege, fragility, superiority, centering, and so on. But aside from wishing to avoid that discomfort, I also believed, maybe still believe in, a historical critique of the overly individualized approach to racism. In the 40s and early 50s, when the Detroit Jews I studied still thought they could save their neighborhoods, in part by teaching people tolerance, they were operating within a larger discourse about prejudice that understood it as an individual pathology. According to this view, prejudice was an illness lodged in the individual's body, and like an illness, it could be cured through individual means. In those years, Jewish organizations produced television spots to convince individuals to get better, to do better. My favorite shows a circus acrobat swinging on a trapeze who then refuses to link hands with various other acrobats labeled Negro or Chinese and so on, each time he falls flat on his face. And the jingle concludes, I'll sing it, it's totally embarrassing, but I will. Don't be a schmo, Joe, be in the know, Joe. Religion and race just don't count in this place. So be in the know, Joe, wherever you go, Joe. Remember that, Joe, and you won't fall on your face. And this was on television, and this was this ad, like a PSA that would appear. All right, that's embarrassing that I did that. Heady with American exceptionalism, mid-century liberals, including many Jews, believed a cure to prejudice was in sight if only enough individuals could do better. And they often shushed the more radical voices that called for massive political and economic change to achieve true equality. By the 60s and 70s, this pathologized and individualized view started to be discredited as groups fought for civil rights legislation that focused on institutions, the electoral system, education, federal programs, more than it focused on individuals. What we know, however, is that those legislative and policy changes, though important, did not set into motion an inevitable arc toward justice. Far from it. Whether measured by school segregation, home ownership rates, neighborhood composition, or employment, the situation for Black Americans today has changed very little from the 60s. And if you add incarceration to the mix, then it has unequivocally worsened. The shift from the pathologized view of prejudice that obligated the individual to the structural approach to anti-discrimination that required institutions to change still did not puncture the heart of American racism. Both of these epistemologies, these ways of knowing, have poor historical track records. Whether fixated on the individual or the broad structures, Americans have failed at confronting or disbanding racism. It's notable that in our moment, the individualized approach, epitomized by Saad or echoed by Robin DiAngelo's white fragility and amplified by anti-bias training, that individualized approach appears to be on the rise. Today, however, those individualized efforts are more often laced with the language of structural change, as thinkers call for an approach that cuts both ways, arguing that structural change is only possible when individuals understand where they stand within the structures. I take a measure of hope from this, but I also think it is precisely this both and approach that has made many Jews feel a little lost right now. If the Reagan approach to being anti-racist today is to understand that structural change cannot happen unless we, each of us as individuals, know where we stand within the system, what happens to the people who've defined themselves in some measure as standing apart from the system? This week's Parsha instructs the Israelites not to copy the practices of the land in which they live, and it thus suggests a posture of remove, as if whatever iniquities or inequities go down, Jews stand aside, never quite dwelling in them. At a 1963 conference on housing and open occupancy in Detroit, the rabbi of the largest congregation in the city proclaimed, "My people have had a long history in the battle for open occupancy. We've lived in some of the foulest ghettos of the world, and we know what it means to be harried and haunted and harassed." He called upon Jewish history, not God's law from the Parsha, but an echo of it, as the source that would eternally enable Jews to stand apart, in this case from mid-century discriminatory housing policies. It seemed the rabbi, and he was and is far from alone, was suggesting that this historical heritage would give Jews the standing to credibly avoid following the customs, here the custom of racism, of the land in which they now lived, even when it appeared they were simply standing on the ground of American racism. I ask you, what is the purchase of the history of Jewish oppression that for many decades in the United States has been a refrain in Jews' discourse about civil rights? Perhaps not all that much. For one, the less visible that history is, the more distant in time and space American Jews feel from it. The less it offers Jews a place to stand removed from American racism, whether regarded as an individual sickness or structural feature or both. And here I want to say something I think might be a bit provocative. I'm saying it to think with you, not to conclude it. But I have found myself wondering if the recent and worthy attention devoted to recognizing that not all Jews are white, and from some quarters, the effort to say that Jews in general are not white, that this is an attempt perhaps to find a new language for that same old posture of remove. And still more provocatively, the rising attention to anti-Semitism, might that also be a way to reassert the gap? Now, let me be very clear, as our politicians are fond of saying, that these observations are not meant to discredit the realities of anti-Semitism or the realities of the diversity of Jews. And tomorrow, I will address all of this more concretely, the puzzle of where American Jews stand within the framework of whiteness and white supremacy, including anti-Semitism. If we're interested in escaping an endless and ineffectual loop about whether individuals or structures will ultimately disband racist systems, it seems, though, that we cannot avoid asking, where do I, the individual, stand within the structure? Structural change is necessary, but insufficient, unless we connect ourselves, our very beings, to it. And for those of us, and maybe this is all of us, who do not always know where we are situated, or who do not like being told where we stand, or who know we are more complicated than any single category, the task of answering the question is difficult and disturbing, and I also think it feels scary. In the Parsha's instruction that we refrain from copying the practices of the land around us, perhaps we are meant to understand that the hyperbole is the point of course, we will be reoriented and remade by those practices. And the task then is always to feel self-conscious about it. We cannot pretend to stand on the edges like some prophet decrying the structures, but we can exercise a measure of control and self-awareness to ask always, is this where I should be standing? And if not, what can I do about myself and the ground under my feet? Shabbat Shalom.
Professor Berman, that was exceptional and so compelling. And as you were speaking, I was filled with regret, this incredible sense of regret that we cannot have you here in person with us, because it's so clear that we're only going to be able to touch the surface of your expertise and experience the depth of your skill as a teacher. But I am happy that we will have a little more time with you, and I hope you all will join Professor Berman and me at the foyer immediately following our service. We'll have some time for some questions. That was really extraordinary and so compelling and created such a great context for all of the things we've been discussing so far this year. So I'm eager to speak with you and see you in a little bit. But in the meantime, we're going